Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in rural Pennsylvania. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the harsh winter of 1890, the isolated farming community of Milbrook Valley, Pennsylvania, became the center of what would later be recognized as one of the most methodical series of disappearances in American criminal history. 7 men, all successful residents of the valley, vanished without explanation over the course of 18 months. What connected these cases was not immediately apparent to local authorities, who initially attributed them to the common hardships of frontier life. At the heart of this mystery stood Venetia Ashmore, a widow of 34 years who had arrived in Milbrook Valley during the spring of 1889. She presented herself as recently bereaved, seeking a quiet place to rebuild her life after the death of her husband in a railway accident in eastern Pennsylvania. Venetia rented a modest farmhouse on the valley's outskirts, approximately 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, and quickly established herself as an invaluable member of the community. Venetia possessed an extraordinary combination of domestic skills that made her indispensable to her neighbors. Her knowledge of herbal remedies was extensive, her cooking was exceptional, and her manner with the sick demonstrated unusual empathy and effectiveness. Dr. Lysander Grimsby, the valley's only physician, would later describe her as possessing medical knowledge that rivaled his formal education, particularly in the treatment of common ailments and the preparation of natural remedies. The first man to disappear was Cornelius Blackthorne, a grain merchant who owned substantial farmland and operated a successful trading business throughout central Pennsylvania. Blackthorne, 43 years old, had been widowed for 4 years following his wife's death from consumption. He had no immediate family and had built his wealth through careful business management and strategic land acquisitions during the agricultural expansion of the 1880s. Blackthorne's courtship of Venetia began in late June 1889 and proceeded with an intensity that surprised even his closest business associates. Previously known for his reserved demeanor and practical approach to life, Blackthorne became almost euphoric during the summer months, speaking constantly of his plans for marriage and expressing confidence that he had finally found the companion who would complete his life. The local storekeeper, Tobias Millwright, maintained detailed records of customer purchases that would later provide crucial insight into the progression of their relationship. Blackthorne's buying patterns shifted dramatically during the summer of 1889. Moving from strictly practical purchases to expensive fabrics, imported delicacies, and luxury items that reflected his efforts to court Venetia with gifts far beyond typical rural standards. Their wedding took place on November 22, 1889, in a private ceremony at Venetia's farmhouse. Only 3 witnesses attended the service: Dr. Grimsby, who performed the ceremony in the absence of a traveling minister, Tobias Millwright, and Cordelia Ravenswood, an elderly woman who served as the valley's midwife and informal social coordinator. The ceremony proceeded without incident, though Ravenswood later noted that Venetia wore black rather than traditional wedding attire, explaining that she felt inappropriate wearing celebratory colors while still mourning her first husband. Following the wedding, Blackthorne moved his personal belongings to Venetia's farmhouse, but initially maintained his separate business operations. During the winter months, neighbors occasionally observed him working around the property or traveling to town for supplies. However, by February 1890, these sightings had become increasingly rare, and Blackthorne's absence from community activities became noticeable. When Millwright inquired about Blackthorne's whereabouts during one of Venetia's visits to purchase supplies, she explained that her husband had been contacted by business associates in California regarding extraordinary opportunities in fruit orchard investments. According to Venetia, The opportunity required immediate capital investment and personal supervision, compelling Blackthorne to liquidate his Pennsylvania assets and travel west to secure his participation in the venture. To support this explanation, Venetia produced a letter allegedly written by Blackthorne and postmarked from Sacramento, California. The correspondence described remarkable profit potential in California agriculture and instructed Venetia to sell his remaining Pennsylvania holdings and prepare to join him once he had established their new enterprise. The letter indicated that the initial development phase might require considerable time, as the agricultural venture demanded his complete attention and involved working with investors who required careful relationship management. Dr. Grimsby examined the letter when Venetia showed it to him and found the handwriting appeared consistent with samples of Blackthorne's writing he had previously seen on business documents. However, something about the letter's content troubled the physician, though he could not immediately articulate his concerns. In his personal journal, discovered many years later, Grimsby wrote that while the handwriting seemed authentic, the language and phrasing appeared unlike Blackthorne's typically straightforward communication style. Despite these reservations, there was no legal basis for challenging Venetia's account of her husband's departure. The business opportunity described was plausible given contemporary reports about agricultural development in California, and Blackthorne was free to make independent decisions about his life and investments. Moreover, Venetia's behavior following her husband's alleged departure seemed consistent with that of a woman whose spouse had left to pursue distant opportunities. The liquidation of Blackthorne's assets proceeded smoothly over the following months. His livestock and farming equipment were sold at reasonable prices to neighboring farmers, and his grain storage facilities were leased to another merchant who continued operating the business under different ownership. Venetia retained control of his land holdings, explaining that she intended to sell them according to her husband's detailed instructions once market conditions became more favorable. This process provided Venetia with substantial financial resources that significantly elevated her status within the community. Rather than remaining a modest widow dependent on small-scale farming and rental income, she became a woman of considerable means with both liquid assets and valuable property holdings. This transformation enhanced her attractiveness as a potential marriage partner and provided her with resources to live comfortably while establishing new relationships. Throughout the spring and summer of 1890, Venetia continued to receive occasional letters from Blackthorne describing his progress in California and expressing optimism about their future financial security. These communications maintained the pattern established in the initial correspondence, combining personal affection with detailed descriptions of business developments and requests for patience as he worked to establish their new life. The second disappearance involved Percival Ashworth, a blacksmith whose skills were essential to the farming community's operations. Ashworth, 39 years old, had lost his wife in a riding accident the previous year and had struggled to manage both his business responsibilities and domestic needs. His initial contact with Venetia began as a practical arrangement for meal preparation, as his attempts at cooking had proven largely unsuccessful. Ashworth's courtship of Venetia developed gradually through the autumn of 1890, evolving from practical assistance to genuine romantic attachment. Unlike Blackthorne's demonstrative approach, Ashworth pursued Venetia with quiet persistence that reflected his reserved personality. He showed his interest through consistent attention, practical assistance with projects around her farmhouse, and increasingly personal conversations about their respective hopes and concerns. Their marriage took place on December 15, 1890, exactly 1 year after Venetia's arrival in Milbrook Valley. The ceremony followed the same private pattern as her first wedding, with identical witnesses and similar vows that acknowledged life's uncertainties and the possibility that circumstances might require the couple to pursue separate paths. Following their marriage, Ashworth initially continued operating his blacksmith shop in town while living at Venetia's farmhouse. However, by March 1891, he began relocating his business operations to her property, explaining to customers that this new location would better serve farming families in remote areas of the valley. The transition gradually isolated Ashworth from regular community contact, as people seeking his services had to travel to Venetia's farmhouse rather than encountering him during routine visits to town. By May 1891, Ashworth's blacksmith services had become virtually unavailable, with customers finding his workshop closed and receiving explanations about large projects requiring uninterrupted concentration. When inquiries were made about this situation, Venetia explained that her husband had been suffering from recurring respiratory problems that interfered with his ability to work consistently around the forge's smoke and heat. In June 1891, Venetia announced that Ashworth had received an offer to establish a blacksmith operation in a Colorado mining community where demand for metalwork was extremely high, and compensation far exceeded what could be earned in rural Pennsylvania. She produced a letter allegedly written by Ashworth describing the guaranteed work and superior wages that made the opportunity impossible to refuse. According to the letter, Ashworth had departed immediately to secure the position before other blacksmiths could compete for the work. He explained that the initial period would be demanding and communication difficult due to the remote location, but he intended to send for Venetia once he had established permanent facilities and confirmed the reliability of the arrangement. Dr. Grimsby noted in his journal that Ashworth's departure followed a remarkably similar pattern to Blackthorn's alleged journey to California. Both men had supposedly received exceptional business opportunities requiring immediate action and separation from their wives while they established themselves elsewhere. While each individual case appeared credible, the repetition of such circumstances seemed to exceed what might reasonably be attributed to coincidence. The third disappearance occurred in the summer of 1891, involving Maximilian Thornfield, a livestock trader who had built a successful business buying and selling cattle and horses throughout central Pennsylvania. Thornfield, 47 years old, possessed substantial liquid assets due to his trading activities and had remained unmarried since losing his wife and newborn son many years earlier. Thornfield's courtship of Venetia began in August 1891, following a different pattern from her previous relationships. As a traveling trader, his interactions with Venetia were intermittent, occurring during his periodic visits to conduct business in Milbrook Valley. However, these sporadic encounters seemed to intensify his attraction, as he found her company refreshing after long periods of solitary travel. Their engagement was announced in October 1891, and their marriage took place on November 28th. Following the ceremony, Thornfield began consolidating his trading routes to spend more time with his new wife, focusing on local and regional transactions rather than the long-distance trading that had previously characterized his business. By February 1892, Thornfield had ceased his trading activities entirely, explaining to business associates that he was evaluating opportunities for large-scale livestock investments that would provide superior returns with less travel. In April, Venetia announced that her husband had departed for Texas to establish a massive cattle ranching operation using his accumulated capital and trading expertise. The letter she produced described extraordinary opportunities in Texas cattle ranching and Thornfield's confidence that he could multiply their wealth through strategic land acquisitions and large-scale livestock operations. The correspondence indicated that the initial development phase would require 18 months of intensive work in remote locations unsuitable for wives, but promised eventual prosperity that would compensate for the temporary separation. The fourth man to disappear was Aurelius Winchester, a traveling merchant who specialized in selling manufactured goods from eastern cities to rural communities throughout Pennsylvania. Winchester, 51 years old, 51, had never married due to his constant travel requirements, but had begun considering the benefits of establishing a stable domestic base for his operations. Winchester's relationship with Venetia developed through the winter of 1891-1892, initially as a business relationship for purchasing items unavailable through local suppliers. His attraction to her grew as he recognized her sophistication and business acumen, qualities that were rare in rural communities and essential for the type of partnership he envisioned. Their marriage in March 1892 was structured as both a personal relationship and a business arrangement, with Winchester investing substantial capital in modifying Venetia's property for commercial use and expanding his inventory to serve regional markets. However, by August 1892, Winchester had allegedly departed for Western territories to establish commercial operations serving railroad construction projects. Venetia produced letters describing exceptional opportunities in the expanding railroad industry, where guaranteed supply contracts offered profit margins far exceeding traditional rural commerce. Winchester supposedly intended to establish permanent operations in multiple railroad construction centers, requiring his complete attention during the initial development phases. The fifth disappearance involved Obadiah Warwick, a miller who operated the essential grain processing facility serving the entire farming community. Warwick, 42 years old, had lost his wife to scarlet fever several years earlier and had remained isolated from social activities until his courtship of Venetia began in late 1892. Their marriage in January 1893 was followed by Warwick's alleged departure in May for Kansas, where expanding wheat production created exceptional opportunities for large-scale milling operations. Venetia explained that her husband had received offers for establishing facilities that would serve vast agricultural regions with guaranteed grain supply contracts, providing extraordinary profits. Warwick's disappearance created significant practical problems for the farming community, as his mill represented essential infrastructure for processing grain harvests. However, Venetia addressed these concerns by funding temporary management of the facility through hired operators, using her accumulated wealth to maintain community services, while her husband supposedly established their future prosperity. The sixth man to vanish was Barnabas Blackstone, a land surveyor whose work mapping property boundaries and assessing development potential had made him knowledgeable about regional opportunities and land values. Blackstone, 40 years old, had built his reputation through careful documentation of territorial boundaries and accurate assessment of mineral deposits and water rights. Blackstone's courtship of Venetia in early 1893 and their marriage in June followed the established pattern, but his alleged departure in October for Colorado surveying work represented the loss of specialized knowledge that had significant economic value beyond his personal wealth. The maps and surveys he supposedly took with him contained years of accumulated information about development opportunities throughout central Pennsylvania. By late 1893, Dr. Grimsby could no longer ignore the pattern that had emerged around Venetia's marriages. 6 husbands had allegedly received extraordinary business opportunities requiring immediate departure and extended separation, each leaving detailed letters explaining their decisions and expressing confidence in eventual success. While individual cases seemed plausible, the accumulation of such coincidences had moved beyond reasonable probability. However, Dr. Grimsby's attempts to interest local law enforcement in investigating Venetia's circumstances met with resistance from Sheriff Horatio Crawford. The sheriff pointed out that no crimes had been reported, no evidence of violence existed, and no indications suggested that any of the men had departed involuntarily. Each husband had apparently left authentic correspondence explaining his departure, and Venetia possessed extensive legal documentation justifying her successive remarriages. Moreover, Sheriff Crawford noted that Venetia had become one of the community's most respected residents, known for charitable contributions and assistance to families facing hardship. Any investigation would necessarily challenge the reputation of someone widely regarded as beneficial to the community's welfare. The seventh and final case would prove fundamentally different from the previous disappearances. Zechariah Fairweather, a traveling preacher who served isolated farming communities, began courting Venetia in the spring of 1894. Unlike her previous husbands, Fairweather's religious background made him sensitive to spiritual irregularities that others had not noticed. Fairweather's courtship was notable for its brevity and intensity, leading to their marriage in June 1894 after only 6 weeks of acquaintance. He explained that extensive prayer had convinced him of divine guidance to marry Venetia and establish a permanent religious mission in Milbrook Valley. However, within 2 months of their marriage, Fairweather began expressing concerns about spiritual irregularities in his wife's behavior. His religious training had taught him to recognize signs of deception, and he noticed patterns that troubled his conscience. These concerns initially focused on Venetia's possession of books and materials that seemed inconsistent with conventional religious practices, her extensive knowledge of herbal preparations that exceeded normal domestic requirements, and her apparent familiarity with practices that had spiritual implications beyond simple folk medicine. More significantly, Fairweather began discovering personal belongings throughout the property that belonged to Venetia's previous husbands. These items included distinctive clothing, jewelry, tools, and documents that should have been taken when the men allegedly departed for distant opportunities. The presence of these objects contradicted the carefully constructed narrative of voluntary departures that had explained each previous disappearance. Most disturbing to Fairweather was his observation of Venetia's correspondence activities. He noticed her writing letters that appeared to be responses to communications from her previous husbands, but he never saw her receive any incoming mail from these men. When he questioned this apparent inconsistency, she provided explanations about irregular mail delivery and the practice of writing responses in advance, to be ready when opportunities arose to send them. Fairweather's suspicions intensified when he discovered what appeared to be draft versions of letters allegedly written by her previous husbands, including correspondence that Venetia had previously presented as evidence of their voluntary departures. These drafts contained corrections and revisions in her handwriting, suggesting that she had composed the letters herself while attempting to mimic each man's writing style. When Fairweather confronted Venetia about these discoveries, her behavior toward him changed dramatically. Rather than providing explanations or attempting to address his concerns, she began engaging in systematic intimidation, designed to make him question his perceptions and memory. She started preparing separate meals for him, claiming special dietary considerations for his religious work. But these meals often left him feeling disoriented and unable to concentrate effectively. Fairweather also noticed his personal belongings being moved or rearranged in ways that seemed calculated to make him doubt his memory and mental stability. Books disappeared from their usual locations, documents were found in unexpected places, and his personal effects were reorganized in patterns that suggested deliberate manipulation rather than casual housekeeping. Most frightening was Venetia's attempt to convince Fairweather to correspond with religious organizations in distant territories, describing opportunities to establish missions among mining communities, and encouraging him to develop detailed plans for such endeavors. When he refused to participate in what he recognized as preparation for his own disappearance, her manipulation became more aggressive and desperate. By October 1894, Fairweather had become convinced that his wife was planning to eliminate him using the same methods she had apparently employed with her previous husbands. His religious convictions prevented him from simply abandoning his marriage, but he began documenting his discoveries and seeking guidance about how to address his increasingly dangerous situation. In his personal journal, later discovered by investigators, Fairweather wrote extensively about his growing certainty that Venetia had murdered her previous husbands. He described finding a hidden chamber beneath the farmhouse cellar that contained personal effects from all 6 previous husbands, organized in a systematic manner that indicated collection rather than casual storage. According to his journal, this hidden space also contained what appeared to be a workshop for producing forged correspondence, including writing materials, samples of her previous husband's handwriting, and draft versions of letters attributed to the missing men. Fairweather documented his discovery of detailed financial records showing the systematic liquidation of each husband's assets following their alleged departures. The crisis reached its culmination in November 1894, when Fairweather failed to appear for his scheduled religious service at a remote farming community. Dr. Grimsby investigated and found that Fairweather had not returned home the previous evening, and that Venetia's explanations for his absence were inconsistent and poorly prepared. Unlike her previous cases involving carefully documented voluntary departures for exceptional business opportunities, Venetia's account of Fairweather's disappearance lacked the meticulous preparation that had characterized her earlier deceptions. She initially claimed he had mentioned visiting a sick family but could not specify which family or location. When pressed for details, she suggested he might have suffered an accident while traveling remote mountain paths. This explanation prompted the first official search for one of Venetia's missing husbands. Sheriff Crawford organized search parties that examined paths Fairweather would have used to reach various communities, but no evidence of an accident was discovered. The search also revealed that no families in surrounding areas had requested or received a visit from Fairweather on the day of his disappearance. The inconsistencies in Venetia's explanations, combined with the failure to find evidence supporting her account, provided Dr. Grimsby with the justification needed to convince Sheriff Crawford to authorize a formal investigation. For the first time since the disappearances began, law enforcement officials were willing to consider the possibility of criminal activity. The investigation began with examination of Fairweather's personal effects at Venetia's farmhouse. Among his belongings, investigators found the detailed journal documenting his discoveries and concerns about his wife's behavior. The journal contained careful documentation of personal effects he had found belonging to previous husbands, descriptions of the hidden chamber beneath the cellar, and his growing certainty that these men had not departed voluntarily. Armed with this evidence, Sheriff Crawford obtained authorization for a thorough search of Venetia's property. The search, conducted in December 1894, confirmed Fairweather's journal entries and revealed physical evidence providing clear indication of criminal activity. The hidden chamber described in the journal was located beneath a false floor in the farmhouse cellar. This concealed space contained an extensive collection of personal belongings from all 7 husbands, including items that should have been taken when they allegedly departed for distant opportunities. The systematic organization of these objects suggested deliberate collection rather than casual storage. More significantly, the chamber contained what appeared to be a complete operation for producing fraudulent correspondence, including draft versions of letters attributed to the missing men, writing materials for practicing their handwriting styles, and samples of their authentic signatures that had been used as models for creating forged communications. The search also revealed detailed financial records documenting the systematic conversion of each husband's assets to liquid capital following their disappearances. These documents showed that Venetia had accumulated substantial wealth through her marriages and had used sophisticated methods to legitimize her control over her victims' properties and investments. Evidence was also discovered indicating that the letters supposedly sent from distant territories had been posted by Venetia herself rather than by the men who had allegedly written them. Receipts for travel to various locations where the letters had been postmarked were found among her personal effects, along with supplies and materials consistent with the production of forged correspondence. The most damning evidence was discovered in a remote area of Venetia's property, approximately half a mile from the farmhouse near a grove of mature oak trees. Here, investigators found multiple burial sites that appeared to correspond to the number of missing husbands. Excavation of these locations revealed the remains of 6 adult males in various stages of decomposition. Medical examination of the remains suggested that all 6 men had died under similar circumstances, with evidence indicating systematic poisoning as the likely cause of death. The county coroner noted specific patterns of bone deterioration associated with plant-based toxins, consistent with Venetia's known expertise in herbal preparations and traditional medicine. Faced with overwhelming physical evidence, Venetia confessed to the systematic murder of her husbands during interrogation by Sheriff Crawford. Her confession revealed that she had developed a sophisticated method for attracting, marrying, and killing men for their wealth, using gradual poisoning techniques that created deaths resembling natural illness. The confession also disclosed that her activities in Milbrook Valley represented only the latest phase of a criminal career that had begun in other communities. Venetia admitted to operating similar schemes in at least 2 previous locations before arriving in Pennsylvania, suggesting that her total number of victims significantly exceeded the 7 men from Milbrook Valley. However, the body of Zechariah Fairweather was never recovered, despite extensive searches of the mountainous areas where Venetia claimed to have disposed of it. This unresolved aspect of the case left questions about whether Fairweather might have survived and escaped, though no evidence of his continued existence was ever discovered. The trial of Venetia Ashmore began in March 1895 and attracted extensive attention throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. The case represented one of the most systematic and calculating series of murders in American criminal history, involving sophisticated planning, extensive deception, and systematic exploitation of social expectations about marriage and domestic relationships. The prosecution presented comprehensive evidence based on physical discoveries at Venetia's property, her detailed confession, and testimony from community members who had observed the pattern of disappearances over 5 years. Dr. Grimsby served as a crucial witness, providing timeline evidence and demonstrating how his growing suspicions had ultimately led to exposure of the crimes. The defense attempted to argue that Venetia suffered from severe mental illness that prevented her from understanding the nature of her actions or distinguishing between right and wrong. However, this strategy was undermined by extensive evidence of premeditation and careful planning revealed during the investigation. The systematic nature of the crimes, the sophisticated legal maneuvering required to justify successive remarriages, the careful disposal of evidence, and the creation of detailed financial records all indicated rational planning rather than mental incapacity. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 7 counts of first-degree murder. Venetia was sentenced to death by hanging, making her one of the few women executed for murder in Pennsylvania during the 19th century. The sentence was carried out on August 22, 1895, ending one of the most disturbing criminal careers in American history. However, several aspects of the case remained unresolved even after Venetia's execution. Substantial portions of the wealth she had accumulated through her crimes were never located, suggesting that assets had been hidden or transferred before her capture. Additionally, her claims about previous victims in other communities were never fully investigated, leaving questions about the true extent of her criminal activities. The case established important precedents in American criminal law and contributed to evolving understanding of serial murder, particularly regarding capabilities of systematic deception and manipulation in domestic contexts. It highlighted vulnerabilities, faced by isolated individuals in rural communities and the importance of maintaining social oversight mechanisms that could identify suspicious patterns before they resulted in serious harm. The farmhouse where the crimes occurred was eventually demolished, and the land was returned to agricultural use. Local residents avoided the area for many years, and several attempts to rebuild on the property were abandoned after brief periods. The site eventually returned to forest, with only foundation stones remaining as physical evidence of the location where 7 men met their deaths. The case continued to influence criminal investigation techniques and legal procedures for decades following Venetia's execution. The systematic documentation of evidence, the careful reconstruction of timeline patterns, and the integration of physical and circumstantial evidence provided models for future investigations involving similar patterns of criminal behavior. More broadly, the case raised fundamental questions about social structures and expectations that had enabled such systematic criminal activity to continue undetected for years. The assumption that women were inherently domestic and nurturing, combined with limited legal oversight of marital relationships, had created an environment where predatory behavior could flourish with minimal detection. Criminologists who later studied the case identified several factors that contributed to Venetia's success in avoiding detection. The social isolation of her victims made their disappearances less likely to be noticed immediately. The lack of formal communication networks in rural communities prevented effective coordination of information about suspicious patterns. The general reluctance to interfere in domestic arrangements provided protection from outside scrutiny. Perhaps most significantly, Venetia's systematic charitable activities and community involvement had created a positive reputation that made criticism or suspicion seem ungrateful and malicious. Her use of accumulated wealth to address community needs had transformed her from a potential suspect into a respected benefactor whose circumstances few people were willing to question. The case also demonstrated the effectiveness of gradual poisoning as a murder method in an era when medical knowledge and forensic capabilities were limited. Venetia's expertise in herbal preparations allowed her to create deaths that resembled natural illness, particularly in an environment where sudden death from unknown causes was relatively common and not necessarily suspicious. The systematic nature of her correspondence forgeries revealed sophisticated understanding of legal and administrative procedures that enabled her to justify successive remarriages and asset transfers. Her ability to navigate complex legal requirements across multiple jurisdictions suggested either extensive research or possible assistance from accomplices who were never identified. Contemporary accounts of the case noted that Venetia's appearance and demeanor provided no indication of her criminal nature. Witnesses consistently described her as pleasant, helpful, and genuinely concerned about others' welfare. This disconnect between her public persona and her criminal activities challenged common assumptions about the ability to identify dangerous individuals based on behavior or appearance. The case influenced subsequent legal developments regarding marriage documentation, asset transfer procedures, and investigation protocols for suspicious deaths in domestic contexts. Several states modified their laws regarding remarriage waiting periods and documentation requirements, partly in response to the techniques Venetia had used to legitimize her successive marriages. The investigation techniques developed during the case, particularly the systematic documentation of timeline patterns and the integration of physical evidence with circumstantial observations, became standard practices in criminal investigations involving suspected serial offenses. The careful reconstruction of Venetia's methods provided a template for identifying similar cases in other jurisdictions. Educational institutions began using the case as an example in legal and medical training programs, demonstrating the importance of maintaining detailed records and recognizing suspicious patterns that might indicate systematic criminal activity. The case became a standard reference for understanding how domestic relationships could be exploited for criminal purposes. Modern criminologists continue to study the Ashmore case as an example of how social conditions and cultural expectations can create opportunities for systematic criminal behavior when adequate oversight mechanisms do not exist. The case illustrates the importance of maintaining community awareness and communication networks that can identify unusual patterns before they result in serious harm. The psychological aspects of Venetia's behavior continue to generate academic interest, particularly regarding the combination of genuine domestic skills with systematic predatory behavior. Her ability to provide legitimate assistance and support to community members while simultaneously planning and executing murders challenges simple categorizations of criminal personality types. The case also raises ongoing questions about the potential frequency of similar crimes during periods when communication was limited and forensic capabilities were rudimentary. The success of Venetia's method suggests that comparable criminal enterprises might have operated without detection in isolated communities throughout the United States during the late 19th century. Today, the location where Milbrook Valley once thrived has been largely reclaimed by forest, with few remaining traces of the community that existed during the 1890s. The farming families who witnessed Venetia's crimes eventually moved away or died, taking their memories of the events with them. Only official records and newspaper accounts preserve the details of what occurred during those 18 months when 7 men vanished without explanation. The case serves as a permanent reminder that criminal behavior can flourish in environments where social oversight is limited and where cultural expectations prevent adequate scrutiny of suspicious circumstances. It demonstrates the importance of maintaining vigilance against those who would exploit trust and social conventions for predatory purposes, regardless of their apparent respectability or community contributions. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that Venetia's methods were remarkably effective and required relatively modest modifications to be applicable in different times and circumstances. Her combination of psychological manipulation, legal sophistication, and systematic planning created a criminal enterprise that operated successfully for years while maintaining complete community acceptance and support. The case of Venetia Ashmore remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of domestic serial murder in American criminal history, providing insights into both the methods used by such criminals and the social conditions that enable their success. It continues to serve as a crucial reference for understanding how evil can hide behind facades of respectability and the importance of maintaining adequate safeguards against those who would exploit society's fundamental assumptions about trust and safety.